Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Jimmy Soni with me. Jimmy is a phenomenal author. One of his most recent books is called The Founders, the story of PayPal. And so super excited to have him on. And one of the things that I think we're going to hear in Jimmy's story is a lot of success that we see takes years in the making. And so as he has done a lot of research to get to where he's at and write the books that he has, there's a lot of dedication that comes before we get the final project. So Jimmy, thanks so much for being on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a very generous intro, and I hope to live up to it.
I have no doubts, my man. So just starting off, you were born in France. So talk a little bit about, the early years and, growing up in a different country than where you end up moving to.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's funny. Because I'm often talking about my books, which are about other people, I end up not talking about myself that much. But the sort of thing I was thinking about when you asked the question is there's this old joke, like, or not a joke, but a kind of like it's like an aphorism among writers who do the kind of work that I do. So like biographies or histories.
Yeah.
And I think it was like Walter Isaacson who said something like he once wrote like some book, and his daughter like had noticed like a pattern in his books, and he goes like something like, well, all biography is just autobiography, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it turns out like my last book, Founders, is about Elon Musk and Max Levchin, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, all these other people who helped to build PayPal, and a lot of them were immigrants to the United States. And I didn't do that consciously. Like I didn't like go out looking for a story about a bunch of immigrants to the United States. But that was kind of the story of my life. Like I was born in Europe. My dad was doing his postdoctoral degree. He left India with my mom. They went to France thinking they'd go back to India. Then when he was in France, he got a job offer in the United States, and they came to the US thinking they'd go back to India. And whatever, 30 odd years later, we're all still here. And so when I came here, it was really funny because my first language was French. My second language was Hindi. And I didn't learn English until I was like 5, 6 years old. And so it was really interesting because I was like in an ESL class, like when I was 5, like trying to figure out the freaking English language. And what the hell is this? I remember my mom told me once, it's funny, I haven't talked about this before, but my mom told me it's like the first or second day of school, I came back and apparently I was like, why can't these people just speak French? Like, what's the problem? Right. And so it was really funny. But it's one of those things. Like I think there's about 10 million different ways to answer your question about kind of the perspective that you get. And a lot of smarter people than me have written about it, meaning like, what does it mean to come to a place when you're totally new? Here's the truth of it is that I didn't choose to come to the States. My parents came here. And I also came at a time when I was like young enough that I could adapt to a new place. I think the one, among other things, and I'll say this about it, is that as somebody who isn't from the United States, who wasn't born here, like I have a lot of gratitude for the country. Like I have, like, I feel like I hit the freaking lottery,
Yeah.
And I don't say that like kind of lightly. I mean it quite seriously, because in France, my life would have been much narrower, like in different ways. Like the educational opportunities are much narrower. The kind of professional opportunities, I think, are a little bit, they're just a little different. They're it's much more, it's a society that is like much, just in terms of entrepreneurship, it's not as kind of open about that. There are a lot of laws that prevent things like side hustle, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying hustlers there. I'm just saying like we have a different kind of culture in the United States around that stuff. And so for me, it was like, it was sort of like one of these things, like, I think temperamentally, I was probably better suited to the US than to France. And so I often feel like, whoa, I found like the perfect country for me, for like in a house. I don't know. And so but I feel very lucky to be an American. I became a citizen when my parents became citizens. So I didn't apply for citizenship, they did. But what's interesting about it is like they had to learn a lot of American history and stuff. They had to like study, take the test, all that stuff. And again, you don't want to make too much of these things because I was 5. Like, what do you know when you're 5?
Yeah.
I kind of grew up in one place. Like, whatever, it is what it is. But I do think because it wasn't because it was unexpected, I appreciate it more. Like I appreciate my Americanness more because I'm like, oh, this like was something I fell into, you know?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Now, as you're growing up, you eventually elect that you're going to go to Duke, which is not an easy place to get into. So, talk a little bit about what the intrigue of Duke was, and what when you were originally picking to go there, why you set sail to Duke.
Oh man. Again, something I haven't really like thought about for a long, long time. Um, yeah, it's there's sort of I'll give the kind of condensed version of it, which is I I was a good student in high school. I really liked school. I saw school as like a competition, like it was like a thing I wanted to like win,
Yeah.
and I was sort of super competitive with all the other kids who were like ranked high, and I did well enough on that and on the SATs and stuff. And I kind of like had a target set of schools, but what's funny is like I applied to like 14, 15 different places. I did not hold back. And the reason is because like the logic for me was like, well, why I didn't even visit any of the schools that I applied to. I just thought, okay, like if they want me, then I'm going to take time to visit. And like why visit before before I know if I can even get in? That doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's sort of like you could buy stuff on Amazon and now you can return it. But like it was sort of a big deal to go visit and spend all this time and money before you knew if the place was going to accept you. So I
Yeah.
didn't apply to like 14, I don't know, a lot of places. And Duke gave me a full scholarship. It was like an academic, Duke always has a bit of a chip on its shoulder because it's competing against the Ivies and it's competing against Stanford. And as one way of dealing with that, I understand it, is like they have a bunch of academic or like merit scholarships. And so I was really fortunate. I won this thing called the University Scholarship. And it's a great program. And it basically makes it so that you've de-risked your college education, right? Because like they take a big chunk of the payment away, like the tuition. And it was kind of, you sort of walk in, and this is like an interesting thing psychologically. You walk in and you're like expected to do things, like you're sort of
Yeah.
like you're really like here and we're paying for this, so live up to it. And so when I went to Duke, it felt like I was special there, and I had the best 4 years. I mean, it was phenomenal. I was it's sort of like all these things about college life that you can look back with some nostalgia, but I think the biggest thing for me was it was just like an endless pool of opportunity. Like it was like
Mm.
I got to meet the most interesting people, have the most interesting conversations. I did everything on campus. I was one of those people. I probably should have done a little less and just slept a little more, but I worked really hard. And it was like a truly wonderful place. I think the other thing is, I'm not sure where you hail from, but when I went from the Midwest to the East Coast, because I grew up in suburban Chicago. And
Yeah.
so when I went from the Midwest to the East Coast, I like met all these people that I like no, they were like using like language and phrases and doing things I had never heard of, like
Yeah.
never ever in a million years had heard of before. And so it was like eye-opening, like I remember once when I was a junior or senior at Duke, I served on like this academic committee on the board of trustees, and I got seated next to this guy. And he was really funny. He was like, you could tell he was a super intense dude, but he was really focused on whatever was on his phone. And then he had like a shirt tail out in the back, like it was so clear. He like was all sort of thinking about that. And then he asked like the most perceptive questions in this meeting, despite the sense that I had that he was not really paying attention. And like, that was David Rubenstein. And he's a billionaire, he founded the
Yeah.
Carlyle Group. And I never would have had the chance to interact with people like that if I hadn't kind of had the educational opportunity. So Duke for me was just like, it was lights out. It was the best place. And I learned so much.
Yeah. Now, to that point, college can be a great spot to make connections, interact with people, and learn from them, but also then give yourself a platform when you get out of school to get a great job and then to kind of start the career. So, you're in kind of the journalism world, and talking through that. That's a tough industry to really get into and climb ranks, right? A lot of people enter in at the entry level and then sometimes we'll just pivot out. This is way too much work. I don't want to keep going in it. So talk a little bit about some of the early success you had getting into the journalism world before you pivot into writing your first novel.
Yeah, it's actually like Actually, I'll do the second part first because I started with the books pretty early, and I think we can dwell there because you're right that like getting the chance to write books is like a weird thing. Like you don't, it's sort of like I didn't grow up knowing any people who wrote books. Like what that, what is that? I like assumed there were people who did it. I just didn't know any of them. And like I would go, it's sort of like I was like, oh, there's a library, that's a place where books are, or like there's a bookstore, that's where a place where books exist. But nobody in my life or in my parents' life was like writing them. And so here's sort of how that story goes, which is, or here's how my recollection of it goes, right? When I was a kid, I loved books. Like I was just like obsessed. And we didn't, when you come to this country and you're sort of new and there's no kind of rich uncle around, right? You just don't have a lot of money. So your parents like don't know. Like it's like my parents didn't know what Boy Scouts was, right? Summer camp, what the hell is summer camp, right? Like what is that? It sounds ridiculous. At summer, we like hang out at home. I was like a latchkey kid,
Yeah.
But part of that was that they would take us, the one thing they knew was like a free resource that they didn't have to spend money on, that was like, could be fun theoretically, was the library. So we would go to the library all the time and just like live there, and it also had air conditioning, so we could like turn the air conditioning off in our house. And so we would go there, and I was like grew up in libraries. Like I would like read everything. And then when they had these summer reading programs, I don't know how familiar you are with any of this, but they had these summer reading programs where you'd get like little prizes like trinkets or certificates for pizza or whatever the hell. And I would obsessively try to dominate my competition.
There it is. There it is. There's the beginning of the competitive
10,
nature,
11,
right?
12 years old. I'm like, I am going to win everything, right? In this reading contest. And so that was like my kind of hobby of choice, was reading. And it was it's like one of the great hobbies, right? Because it's pretty low cost. You can kind of do it anywhere. It doesn't require a lot of gear, right? Like it's like even as an adult, it's like, man, I like lucked out of my choice of hobbies. I'm not like a skiing person or a golf person. That stuff costs real money. And not that I don't like those things, just that I have this thing of like, I'm often happiest. I started this morning, like buried in the corner of my couch, reading a book, and I couldn't have been happier, right? So I had that as a kid. And so I read everything. And then when I got to kind of high school and college, I started writing more, and like writing in public. And one of the things I always tell like kind of students who are younger is you will work harder on something you write for the student paper than you will for your college classes. And the reason is because your friends will read it. And if you write badly or say something dumb, your friends will make fun of you. That's way more painful than getting a B on a paper, right? And so I started writing in public. Like I would just write for the school paper at Duke, and I did columns and stuff. And that was really fun. It was like a really, really interesting thing. And I, even then though, in college, I didn't have any like grand plans of like, oh, here's how I'm going to do books. Here's how it happened. So, and this is kind of apropos of like the moment when you knew, right? When I was reading a book called Rubicon and by Tom Holland. And it was this history of Rome. And it was like the late Republic of Rome. So like Caesar and Cicero and all of these people who were basically like just fighting with each other all the time. But it's a beautiful book. And I went on Amazon to buy more books about Rome. And I bought a biography of Cicero. I bought a biography of Caesar. And I tried to buy a biography of Cato. And I didn't find anything. And it was really weird to me because he was one of the big three or big four from that time. And I was like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. Like, like why wouldn't that exist? And so what I did is actually like, I had this friend. This is a funny story. A friend of mine from college was this guy, Rob Goodman. And Rob was just like a ridiculously talented writer. He was 1 year older than I was, and we were debate partners at Duke. We were both living around Washington, D.C. at the time that like I had this like notion of like, why hasn't anybody done this biography of Cato? And I wrote to Rob, kind of like sent him an email or something. I said, hey, listen, man, do you want to jump on the phone real quick? I have an idea. And he was like always very indulgent of like the crazy ideas I had. And so I said, hey, we should write the biography of Cato. And he's like, we don't like how we're not like classics people. We're not like history professors. Like, what are you talking about? And I said, no. Like, we don't have to be. All we have to do is write a proposal. And if we write a proposal and someone likes it, they'll give us money, and then we can just write the book, you know? And I said, the way I explained it to him is I said, look, what's the worst thing that happens? We spend some time, we write a proposal, and everybody turns us down. Like, but well, no big deal. Like, who cares? All we did was burn a little bit of time. We were in our early 20s anyway.
Yeah.
The most expensive commodity we had, et cetera. I was like, why not? And I said, look, best case scenario, we have a proposal done and someone buys it, or later when you and I are doing more writing things, someone says, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? And you'd be like, I have, and here's my proposal. Here you go. Right.
Yeah.
And so that proposal was bought by St. Martin's Macmillan, which was one of the big publishers. Totally unexpected. Rob and I had no background in this, right?
Yeah.
But we were good writers. We could tell a story. And we figured we would just like make up we would like hustle to understand the rest, which is exactly what we did. And so that is how my first book came about, was just like an idea, looking on Amazon to like sort of see like, wait, there's like an opportunity here. And then just deciding that like the worst thing that could happen with it was that somebody said no to the proposal.
Yeah.
And it was like not that big of a deal.
So I want to highlight that because, we're talking about in the, landscape of writing a book, but there's other people that are listening that they've been thinking about starting a business. They've been thinking about doing something, and the barrier to entry for them is, well, yeah, but I don't know if it's going to work. And the reality is no one really knows if something's going to work, and you can come up with the world's best plan before you ever get input or feedback. But the world's best plan to you may not actually be the world's best plan to the market you're going to. So talk a little bit about, being willing to just step into something without knowing exactly where it's going to go or if it's even the right thing.
Yeah, it's a really, 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 I mean, we should spend some time on this one because I think it's one of the biggest things that people face in life is, and by the way, this can be true of having a kid. It can be true of starting a business. It can be true of pretty much anything, right? And it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about because I don't know how you're wired, but I'm wired to be anxious about everything. I literally will like overthink. I was actually talking to a friend of mine the other day, and I remember like 2 years ago, I was a part of some group, and as like a thank you for the group, this really nice person sent us all temporary tattoos. And I spent 7 months stressing about whether to put a temporary tattoo on my arm, and ultimately threw it away because I was like, that's how, I'm wired that way.
I'm not wired that way. I don't even know if I spent 7 months wondering if I should get the real tattoo. Right. But either way, I'd love to hear this.
Well, and it would taunt me. It would sit there like staring at me, and I was like, should I? Shouldn't I? Is it better? What's it gonna do? And like, it's a temporary tattoo, bro. Just calm down. And so that's how I'm wired, which means I'm wired that way for everything. Like, I overthink a lot of stuff. So let's get into this. Yeah. A couple thoughts on it. The first is the following. When Rob and I were working on this project, both of us were also working full time. We were, I think, 23, maybe 22, 23, 24. And he had a job on Capitol Hill, and I had a job in the mayor's office in Washington, D.C. When we decided to write a proposal for a book, we did not quit our day jobs. We didn't give up our health insurance, right?
Yeah.
We basically assumed that it wasn't going to work. And what we would do is just do it nights and weekends and do it in like a limited way. Yeah. And even when we signed the contract, Phil, like, we didn't quit our jobs. We just did it on the side, right? And that's like one really important thing. And this is something I often like think about for myself. If you put too much like pressure or stakes on something that you're like pretty uncertain about, you have made it like far more difficult than it needs to be, right? Yeah. And it was really, here's like, I'll give you actually a story from that time. Like, what Rob and I would do to hold ourselves accountable and to actually get it done is, like, we would get together in the evenings. When we were writing the proposal, I had an office like that I could let him into. So I'd let him into the office, and we'd like use the whiteboard and the printers and stuff. Thank you, McKinsey and Company. And checks in the mail. And so the interesting thing was, like, we would actually treat it as work. So he would come to the office. we didn't like sit around or like accidentally fall into a Netflix series, you know.
Yeah.
We would sit, and like Mondays, Wednesdays, I think even Fridays, we would work from 7 to 9. And again, like both of us at the time were single. We like, you know, we had nothing better to do. Like, why not? And so from 7 to 9, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we would get together and we would just talk and like write and work on the proposal. And again, I always said to Rob, I was like, look, man, the worst thing that happens is that we learned how to write a book proposal, right? Like, you and I are nerds about this stuff anyway, like Roman history and stuff. But the worst outcome here is we fail and we spent some evenings together and we learned how to do a freaking book proposal. And like, that's great. Like, we learned a new skill, right?
Yeah.
And what we did, we didn't know anybody who was like famous or a writer. So we just Googled book proposals, right? And like did our best job at imitation. So my first piece of advice always is like, don't put so much risk or pressure on yourself if you can avoid it by like going all in at your first thing. Like, that's like kind of crazy, you know? Even the greatest entrepreneurs of our time, some of the people I interviewed, Elon Musk. Yes, people look at him now with SpaceX and with Tesla. I found an ad in his student newspaper in Canada for his first business, one of his first. It was called Musk Computer Consulting. And it's like, even at like he wasn't like betting the farm then, you know, he wasn't like, he was building something and learning the skills of what it takes to build something. So that's sort of thought one. Here's thought two. I have a lot to say on this, as you can imagine, like, as you can see. Imitation is critical. So here's what I mean. Rob and I knew only a little bit of Latin from like high school. We weren't Roman history professors. We really didn't know anything, right? Like, we were really novices. We didn't even like write for real publications. You know, it wasn't like Rob was like a New York Times writer or anything like that, right? We just like had an idea. But what we were really good at least what I tried to always do, was find stuff that was like exactly like our project, just about a different person, right? And so here's an example. Anthony Everett is an author. He wrote a book about Cicero. It's called Cicero. We took that book, and I mean, I must have I think I broke the binding on it. Like, I'd read it so many times and marked it up and stuff. And the reason is, like, I would count like the number of words in a chapter, because like, how the hell, there's no rules, you know, you don't know in the thing. I would look at how he structured things. I would look at like, you know, how long was it? How did he do footnotes? How did he do his index? What does his table of contents look like? You know, what's a dedication in a book? Like, all that stuff. And all we did was just imitate. And, you know, people are like, well, you know, you're writing a book. And I'm like, well, yeah, but people have written books before. Figure it out. You know, just look at what everybody else has done and do that really, really, really aggressively. And then your own stuff starts to blend in and you created a new thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's like another way to overcome what you were asking about, which is, how do you overcome the like fear of that this could not work out? Just imitate something that did work out. Like, it's like, just
that's
like,
really good.
You know, and then do that. And then the last thing I would say is, I could not have done that book alone. I was not accountable to myself as much as I was accountable to my friend Rob. That's because good. If I didn't show up on Wednesday night, it's one thing to disappoint yourself, but it's another, like, your buddy has carved out time for you. He's there slogging away, and you are like screwing around. No, like, I was like never like that. So what we did, so we wrote the proposal, we found an agent, the book sold miraculously. We were like, wow, these people are stupid. Like, we don't know anything, right? And so, and it ended up being a really good book, but we were like, wow, go figure, the world's funny. In order to write the book, we did like the same sort of schedule. And then Saturdays and Sundays, like, I would go to, so Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, whatever it was, Rob would come to me. And then Saturdays and Sundays, I would go to Rob's place, and we would just write kind of during the day, like noon to 6, right? And I like the act of like showing up at your friend's home to work on something, or him showing up in my home. Like, we would sometimes sit in silence for 6 hours, but we were there, and like we would do it. And you're just, you know, people, people are they have the capacity to be accountable to others, I think, more than they have the capacity to be accountable to themselves. Not everybody.
Yeah.
There are like super people who like can, do the other thing. I can't. And so what's good for me is like having a system where I'm like, I'm in this for Rob. And like, if I'm a jerk about it, we're not going to get it done, but I'm disappointing a human. I'm not disappointing, the project. I'm like actually disappointing my. So
that's
those
good.
are 3 strategies. I'm sorry to go on at some length about it, but I think it's really important because I'll tell you, the fear doesn't go away. Like in terms of starting something new, I'm sure you can appreciate this. Like you're always a little afraid. And if people don't, I think a lot of times people think of creative people like the biggest creative people in the world. And if you think that they're not facing these same fears, like trust me, they are, right? And every person has a story like that, and it doesn't go away. Like even now, when I start a new project, I'm terrified all the time.
Well,
you have to learn these techniques as you go along. But I think that first step, those 3 things can help. Number one, let's go in reverse order. Find a buddy, be accountable, like imitate like crazy, and just sort of like make it happen, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that I would highlight there is the fear may never go away, but if you borrow hope from someone else's experience first, after you have some successes and some learning experiences yourself, then that gives you the reinforcement that, well, it worked one time, it could work again. And so for you write the first book, and then we head to book number 2, A Mind at Play. And once again, we're sticking down the biography world. So talk a little bit about how that idea came to be and writing the second one.
Yeah. And it's funny, I'll do the second one and I'll do a failed third one so that people don't think it all works out all the time, right? So I had like Rome's Last Citizen, which was the first book. Like it did pretty well for a book about Roman history. Like Tim Ferriss sort of made it a thing, and he was really kind and generous with his platform and like put it out there in the world, and it was great. And a bunch of people who are really interested in Stoicism got into Cato because Cato was kind of one of the world's first Stoics, first mainstream Stoics. And so that happens, and then once you do one thing, you're kind of always like, you always look at the world through that lens. And so I started looking at the world like through a book lens, like what are other books that I could plausibly write? And that's like it's like really great to like live, I'm sure you sort of have this with podcasting, like it's like, oh, that's like awesome, because now you sort of always are looking you're noticing different things. Actually, it's one of the best things about doing creative work is you just notice different things than you did before, right? Absolutely. And so I had a friend who sent me a book called The Idea Factory, which is about the history of Bell Labs. Bell Labs is like, I don't know, it's like the LA Lakers of technology or something. Like it's like the most like epic. They invent the transistor, touch tone dialing. They invent satellites. I mean, they invent everything. And so he sent me this book, and he had added a little note. He said, you should write your next book about Claude Shannon. And I was like, whatever. Like people are always suggesting ideas. But then I read this book and I'm like, man, Dan might be right. And so I go online on Amazon again, and I type in Claude Shannon. And there was a book where he was a character and like a subject, but there was no biography. So again, I write to Rob, who was living in New York at this time. So we were both living in the same place again. And I was like, hey, Rob, I think we should write a biography of Claude Shannon. And he was like, what? We don't know we're not electrical engineers. Like, we don't know anything. And I said, no, it's the same thing as Rome's Last Citizen. We don't know anything, but we can figure it out along the way.
Yeah.
And so we started diving into his story. We learned that he was actually like a really, really interesting person. He was this scientist engineer type who also was a juggler. He loved gambling. He loved stock picking. He liked cars. He was sort of like Richard Feynman, but he never chased the fame.
Yeah.
And so we were like, there's a story here. And we met with Simon and Schuster, and we met with really specifically this is my editor who passed away a few years ago. Her name was Alice Mayhew. And if your listeners know like the movie Lincoln, which was based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's book Team of Rivals, if you know Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, if you know like pretty much any big history book for whatever, is like Alice Mayhew probably edited it. Like it's actually sort of a joke. Like she's like edited everything that was like big and important in that genre. And so my agent set us up with a meeting with her, and we just pitched her. It was like this sort of fancy New York meeting, and like I was totally I was not unprepared for the meeting. I was unprepared for the setting and the formality of it. Right. So we go there. I make the pitch, and I was like, look, Alice, this is like A Beautiful Mind, but for like this guy, Claude Shannon. Have you read A Beautiful Mind? And she was so cool. She was like, she laughs. And I was like, why are you laughing? And she goes, Jimmy, of course I've read A Beautiful Mind. I edited A Beautiful Mind. It's like, whoa, okay.
Yeah, mic drop.
Yeah. And I was like, damn, that book won a Pulitzer and it was made into a movie and all the rest. And so a National Book Award, not a Pulitzer. And so she bought the book about Claude Shannon, which was called A Mind at Play. And it was the same sort of deal. Like Rob and I we weren't electrical engineers, we weren't scientists, but we figured like if you're not someone who does that, then actually like you're gonna have to explain it to somebody who isn't also an electrical engineer. And if we could explain it to ourselves, other people would understand it. And so we went and we did that book, and it did really well. And it turned out there was still like room in the world for that kind of book, meaning people got into it because there are a whole bunch of people who really admire Shannon and like really, and you know, he had like an exquisite mind. And so we did that. But I wanted to tell the story of the book project that never was. Because it's funny, after I did that book, you know, Simon & Schuster was like, all right, whenever you have an idea next, like, let us know. And the idea that I wrote basically a full proposal on that never happened was a biography of Bruce Lee. So I got really interested in his story. He was kind of like Tony Robbins before there was Tony Robbins, or Tim Ferriss before there was Tim Ferriss. Like he wasn't just a martial arts movie star. He was also, like, the way I described in my proposal is he was like the patron saint of self-improvement, right? He trying out new things. He would take steaks, put them in a blender and liquefy them, and then use them to get protein. I mean, like crazy stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, that idea of like rigorous self-improvement is very much a part of the American like tradition, right? It's like goes back to Ben Franklin, and like, at least in written terms, it goes back to Ben Franklin. And so I was like, well, you could trace a line like Franklin, Bruce Lee, Tim Ferriss.
Yeah.
like, you know, and so what I did was I wrote this proposal because I thought a serious biography could actually work. And then Simon & Schuster let me know that actually, under sort of in the background, they had been approached by an author who had already finished his book about Bruce Lee, but was unhappy with his publisher. And they said, look, we're thinking about buying this book, but we don't want to step on your toes if you feel like you have something different or new that you want to do with it. And in learning about that project, I was like, look, this guy, the guy who wrote the book, like he spoke Mandarin, he did martial arts. I was like, okay, like I'm going to back off. Like, you got your book. And so Simon & Schuster bought that book about Bruce Lee. I put that proposal in a drawer, never did anything with it. Right. But it also goes to show you that not all of the wells that you go after are going to have oil in them. Right. Like, you just know, and you have to just sort of plant like little things here and there to some extent to see what's going to bite. Yeah. So I'm sorry, that's again a longer answer than you maybe wanted, but it was the project that never was this biography of Bruce Lee.
I love it. Well, and one thing that I want to highlight that, you know, you keep reiterating is, and I think it's interesting because I could definitely see somebody listening think, well, if you Google something and there's not a biography about that person, clearly there's not a market for that, right? Because if somebody wanted to know the story, someone else would have wrote the book. But I love that your mindset wasn't that, right? It wasn't, oh, well, no one wants to hear it. It's like, well, if no one else has done it, if I'm interested by it, someone else is probably interested by it. I'll go pursue it. And I think, once again, somebody that's sitting here with an idea and they say, oh, well, no one else is doing it, it probably isn't that great of an idea. It's like, well, no, it actually might be one of the greatest ideas, but somebody has to be the person to go do it. They have to be the catalyst to get the ball rolling.
That's 100% right. And I'll add two other sort of thoughts on that, because it's really important, because it's not, you know, you shouldn't assume that just because you had the idea, like, you should be the one to do it. Yeah. And you also shouldn't assume that just because it doesn't exist, there's like a reason that it doesn't exist. Right. Yeah, right. Here's what I would say about that. You know, this is not a story about me, but one of my favorite stories is the founding of Kettle and Fire Bone Broth. Do you know about this?
No.
So Kettle and Fire, you know, now they're like a brand that's like everywhere, right? Yeah. I remember reading some case study on some site. I think it might have been Medium, but I don't remember where it was. I should find it and send it to you. So you can link to it in the show notes or send it out. When the founder of that company was testing his idea, he didn't actually know how to make bone broth. He didn't even know he wanted to make bone broth. all he did was buy search ads and send people to a site where they could give him money for bone broth. And he thought that if the search ads worked, then he would go figure out how to make the product, right?
Yeah.
He tested the company, like I think it was like a $500 test or like $100 test. It was so small. And he ended up getting so many orders that he wrote back to every person that ordered and was like, hey, I'm really sorry. I don't have any product for you, but when I do, you'll be the first to get it. And he returned all the money. But it was proof that there was a market for it.
Right.
In my books, I could look at Google, kind of like Google search results. I could look at the amount of stuff that was out in the world about Claude Shannon. I could sort of see like, there have been these 3 other books. These 3 books did really well. That's crazy. And I could sort of back into a logic for why it would work. And anybody can do that. I mean, none of the things I just described require special access. I had a computer and Google, it wasn't like I had some big knowledge or anything. I just like searched around and looked around and was like, okay, that makes sense. Here's an example. I knew that Beautiful Mind had won awards, got turned into a movie, and was really successful. And I was like, well, if a book about John Nash can work, then a book about Claude Shannon might not be as successful because he didn't have the same kind of drama. And like, I didn't, I'm not friends with Russell Crowe, but I was like, oh, I could like figure out how to make this work kind of like this.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is I have this habit, and it's like something I like try to keep primed whenever I can, which is I want to find the reason why something doesn't exist before I assume that like, just because it doesn't exist is not a good idea. Like somebody has to convince me out of it, if that makes sense. Like they have to like say, no, like you can't write the biography of Bruce Lee because Matthew Polly has already been working on it, dude. So like, slow your roll, like stop, right? Yeah. And for me, that's really important. And I think, by the way, that is true in business. It's true in like life in general. Like look for someone to give you a convincing argument. And it has to be convincing. Like it has to actually pass the smell test for why something doesn't exist. Don't assume if it doesn't exist, there's not a market for it, right? How many ridiculous things have been created in the world? If the world can sell people chia pets, I mean, seriously, you can sell anything, right? Yeah. Like if we could sell Tamagotchis and like all the schlocky stuff we sold in the 90s to people, you can sell anything, right? Yeah. Or create anything, right? It's sort of like, I really genuinely think like, you don't need to feel like your idea is super new, and you also don't need to assume that just because it isn't there, it's not a good idea. It could be a great idea.
Yeah, that's really good. I love it. So heading into, book number 3 that does get written. So book 4, or the process of book 4, the founders, this is a 6-year research process for you. So I would imagine by far the lengthiest of your research processes to go through. So talk a little bit about where the idea came from and then just the beginning pursuit, because you do end up spending, one-on-one time with, the most important people to this story. So talk a little bit about how you get traction in being able to get in front of these people, because I'm sure they get requests very frequently for interviews, and for them to say yes to somebody, there had to be a little extra incentive for them, or a connection there.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And you're right, it was by far the longest. And a lot of the 6 years was spent making sure that I could actually get the trust and the access to speak to, Reid Hoffman or Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or Max Levchin. And you remember, like, at least I think all the people I just named are like billionaires or close. And right. They can do anything, it's sort of like when you're at that level, your time is actually your most expensive commodity. And you're typically, the stakes are super high for everything you do. And so for you to take hours out of your day to talk to somebody, that's actually a sacrifice. It doesn't sound like one, but like when you're at that level, it really is, because we think our inboxes are bad. Just like imagine what it's like being Reid Hoffman. Like, geez, the guy gets hit up for everything, Yeah. So here's a little bit of how that happened, or how it came to be. When I finished the Claude Shannon book, I had talked earlier about like Bell Labs, and sort of they were like the Lakers or the Bulls, or, the kind of dynasty of tech. And I started thinking, like, what are other teams within technology that have done exceptional things? Not where one person is the like clearly visible face of a brand, like Steve Jobs, Apple, Jeff Bezos, Amazon. I was like, where is it where you get like a really crazy group of people who are together at one time? Yeah. And there are a few of these places. Bell Labs is one. Another is Fairchild Semiconductor. Another is Xerox PARC. And another one is what's known now as the PayPal Mafia. And I, like the others, had all had books done about them. And because of the level of fame and wealth that's within the PayPal alumni group, I just assumed somebody had already done the book. So what did I do? Dude, I went to Amazon. I was like, go to Amazon, figure it out, see if there's something there. And if there's nothing there that's satisfactory to me, then maybe there's a there, right? So I go on. Peter had written his book 0 to 1. Reed had written his books on business, blitzscaling, and whatnot. And there was a book called The PayPal Wars. There was a memoir from an employee who worked there. But what I saw immediately was I was like, oh, that's one person's perspective on this story. Or it's books written by the people who participated in it. But that means that there's not like a story there. It's their story, really.
Yeah.
And so what I had, all I had to start was an idea and a friend who knew Peter Thiel. And I wrote to my friend, Ryan Holiday, and I said, hey, I've had this book idea, and I think it could be something. He had done a book where Peter was a character. And I was like, could you set me up just for a meeting if you're open to it? Like, no pressure. And Ryan was great. He was like, man, he'll love that idea. You should totally pitch him. And, you know, wherever it goes, it goes. And he said, I can't promise I'll write you back, but you never know. So Ryan sent an intro to Peter, and I wrote back to Peter, and I said, you know, here's the idea. I'd love to meet and talk about it. And so Peter was really gracious. He was like, that sounds interesting. He's one of these people, like, I think he takes a lot of meetings when he just thinks something's interesting.
Yeah.
And that's a great quality, actually. Like, it's taught me a lot. And so I went to his home in New York, and we sat down, and I had done a lot of homework coming into the meeting, but I still didn't know which way he would go. And my basic pitch was, look, you know, this book should be written. Like, somebody should do the definitive history of where you all started your professional lives at PayPal. And that said, if there's some reason why you don't think that you want to talk about it, I can totally appreciate that. And I'm not going to like fight you for it, right? Meaning, if you want to talk to me, I will do the book. But if you don't want to talk, I really like won't get as much as I need to make it successful. You know, It's not one of these things where there's like, oh, and I didn't want to do that. It just felt icky and like weird. Like it felt adversarial, and I don't have to do this. This is not my day job, right?
Right.
And my pitch was sort of roughly that I said, look, you attracted to that company the founders of YouTube, LinkedIn, SpaceX, Tesla, Palantir, Matterport. I mean, every company that is a company, you know, of consequence in tech. And then you also funded the next generation of startups on top of that.
Right.
And in how is it that in your 20s, all of you were at one place at one time, right? Like how is that possible? And I said, and the second thing is, what actually happened there? Because I said, here's the thing, because you've all become, you know, who you've become, people don't know like the part of you that's not happening today, right? You kind of don't know, like, what was Peter Thiel thinking about when he like didn't get a Supreme Court clerkship, and how did he end up in Silicon Valley when he was living on the East Coast, right?
Yeah.
There's all these things that like, I want to know how you met Max. I want to know what attracted you to Max and why you invested in him when you were investing in so many other entrepreneurs. So here's what happened. I did my whole pitch. It was much shorter than that, but he laughed and he said, you know, I have actually thought about writing this book, the book you're describing. And he said, but I don't want to do it. He said, I just have too much going. He said, like, you have too much going on. It's like not my project at the moment. So I think you should do it. And he's like, and he said, and he looked at me and he sort of said, there are so many crazy stories. And I could just tell, I was like, oh man, this is so much better than I thought it would be. Right.
Yeah.
And Peter, I appreciate that. I agree with you, obviously. I said, but I will need time with you and maybe one or two introductions from you to some of the people where if I did a cold outreach, it wouldn't work. And he said, yeah, that's great. And that's exactly what he did. Now, the reason people are like, oh, so why didn't the book just take a year after that? Well, it's because PayPal has several hundred employees, and I didn't just want like the story of Peter, right? You have to get the story of all these other people. And I never wanted to abuse the privilege of Peter making introductions. I think I asked Peter to introduce me to Ken Howry, and I think I asked Peter to introduce me to Reid Hoffman, and that was it. I never asked him for any other introductions. And the reason is because I knew that like, that's just annoying.
Yeah.
He's a busy guy and he has like a million people making asks. And so if you're the person who only has 2 asks and you could do the rest on your own, like he'll actually like, I think appreciate that. Now, maybe that was stupid of me. Maybe I should have asked for more, but what I did then was once I met Ken Howry, great interviewer and like great interviewee and like learned a lot. I said, hey, can you introduce me to Luke Nosek, right? And so I got that happened. And then I met Max. And with Max, I knew I was like, I can't ask him for anything. And I didn't ask him for I don't think I asked him for a single intro. But I knew that if I went to the engineers who worked for Max before I spoke to him, and they went back to him and said, hey, there's this guy writing this book about PayPal, what is he doing? Then he would say no. But because I had spoken to him, when other people that I reached out to asked him, he was like, yeah, like he's cool, like he's nerdy and like he's kind of intense, but like you should talk to him, And so that's how it happened. And then I tried to never, ever, ever ask anyone for more than like 1 or 2 links. But you can imagine, like for a book that took 300 interviews, that's a lot of like this and that. And then a lot of people I reached out to cold, but I couldn't even reach out to people cold until I reached out to the people that they knew within the company, because it's like brain obvious. If I reached out to like a friend of yours asking about you, the first thing that friend would do is they'd be like, forward, Phil, like, hey, who's dude? He's like, is this legit? Which happened like 100 times during my writing of PayPal. Like everybody would talk to everybody else and be like, who's this Jimmy guy? Like, we don't know him, right?
Right.
And then it was a matter of like earning that trust, learning as much as I could, actually writing the thing, right?
Yeah.
That is the way, again, a long answer to the question, but it's the way that I got to have the chance to interview all these people and to actually have them be honest and like talk to me and not just like give me talking points and stuff. And it ended up being great. Like it was like I had ultimately, I think I had like 5 or 6 interviews with Peter and a few with Elon and tons with Max. And it was really, they were very, by the end, once I got over that initial hurdle, they were very generous with their time. But like, that's how it happened.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I found interesting that you talked about, and you emphasized it with Elon, but I mean, I'm sure it would be the case with a lot of others, is the sheer ask they had of people and what it took to make the company what it is. Now, I think the tough thing is, if you're not a part of the mission, if you don't understand where something's going and you're not bought in, you hear these unreal things that somebody would be asking someone to do. Work until 2 a.m, right? Work, 80 hours a week. And you'd say these guys are crazy. Like, what's happening? But if you rewind the clock, there were so many people that were bought into the mission of the company and doing something that was revolutionizing the world, right? The history of the way business had been done, that they were bought into that. And that's a part of being a great leader, right? Is you can use your influence to help people understand that, hey, it's not just your job. Like, we're asking you to do something that will change history. You'll have a book written about you, right? So talk a little bit about what you learned from talking to the leaders and how they would, create a culture and a group of people that wanted to pursue a mission more than just pursue a dollar amount they were getting paid.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's interesting because it's one of the things that, so I'll answer it 2 different ways. One is a focus on Elon. Mm-hmm. So if you interview the engineers who work for him, you get a very different picture of the person than if you read whatever, CNN wrote about him today.
Yeah.
And here is what, a number of people who work for him said. They said, I would say particularly the earliest employees who joined his half of the company. And for listeners who aren't familiar with the story, there's kind of PayPal is 2 companies in one. It's a company created by Elon Musk called X.com. And it's a company created by Max Levchin and Peter Thiel called Confinity. They have a product called PayPal, and they join forces in this kind of crazy merger thing that happens in 2000. And it's really messy and, Shakespearean and hilarious. And so here's sort of the getting back to my point. people who interviewed with Elon would say, I signed up because he said we were going to crush the banks, or like we were going to take over finance. And he was so convinced of it. And his vision was so big. And he was like, we're going to revolutionize money as we know it, and they weren't, it was kind of like they signed up because someone had said to them, this is going to be an enormous challenge. I'm going to ask you to do crazy things, but it's going to be the most thrilling ride you've ever had in your life, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
More substance than that, but a version of that, which is kind of that like Shackleton challenge with endurance, right? You're going to be cold, you're going to be tired, you're going to be hungry, but this is going to be epic, right? And I think, that's inspiring to a certain kind of person. It makes tolerating 80, 90, 100-hour work weeks possible, right? Yeah. Like if you think you are a part of something that is very, very big, it's a qualitatively different experience to do that than like joining a job where you're like, you will be home at 5 o'clock on Friday, and by the way, like that works for some people. Like some people, the other thing, but if you were young and hungry and in Silicon Valley in 1997, 98, 99, even to some extent 2000, 2001, you wanted to work for somebody who was like, no, we're going to like destroy JP Morgan.
Yeah, right.
We're going to make Chase Bank irrelevant, right? And that bigness of vision is very attractive. Like it's very attractive to people who want a big vision at that time in their lives. And it means you can sort of suffer through a lot of other stuff because it's so big. Imagine and I haven't interviewed them, but there's a book about the early days of SpaceX called Liftoff. And it's by a brilliant writer, Eric Berger. And like everybody, like the first 10 employees at SpaceX, like thought they were taking on like Boeing and NASA and like everybody who would come before them, and they knew it could fail, and they knew it was risky, and they knew it was kind of crazy. But now it's sort of like you look back on it and you're like, well, of course reusable rockets were supposed to be a thing,
Right.
And so I think that kind of bigness of vision, it allows you to just like get through, among other things, it's great for recruiting, right?
Yep.
But it also allows you to like get through a lot of difficult times, which basically the 4-year story of PayPal that I wrote about is just like difficult moment after difficult moment. Here's the one thing I would say though, that sort of idea, that big vision works for some people. That is the reason they want to come to work every day. It doesn't work for everybody.
Yes.
And so what I would say is like PayPal is the story of people with a big vision. It's also the story of Max Levchin, a really gifted engineer, kind of promising, particularly for his group of engineers, like the best engineers you'll ever work with, right? The smartest engineers you'll ever work with, the most interesting problems, a sense that people have control over the like fixing of those problems, that they're not trapped in some crazy bureaucracy. So what I would say is like, there's a bunch of things that can make it so that someone wants to work really, really hard. And for one person, it might be that the engineering challenges are just like epically interesting. And for another person, it might be like, I want to bring down finance. I want to like change finance forever. And like that's what. So I just want to add a little bit of texture there.
Well, and what I would say, kind of two things that makes me think of is one, everyone's motivated by something different, right? Like, you think about just, let's say fitness, for example. Someone might be motivated to get in great shape so they can attract a spouse. Someone might be motivated by fitness because they saw a parent pass away early and they don't want that to happen. Someone might be motivated by be able to walk a child down an aisle for a wedding, right? All of those different things, it's just connecting with what motivates you. Now, the other piece that I think is interesting in what you said, though, is just even the kind of the evolutionary process of the business, right? In the beginning, you might really feel like I am working with the best of the best, but eventually, if the idea takes off and you go to scale, it's just not, the reality is you just can't hire the best of the best for 10,000 people, right? Like at some point you start adding people on, and it's like, we just need somebody that's going to fill this role. We can't attract all of the best talent at all of the best positions. And so if the company doesn't have the desire to continue to pursue some brand new idea or, make pivots, and they're just, hey, we're made it really big and we just want to plateau here, you may start feeling like some of those original people lose that luster of what was originally discussed.
Yeah, though I would say it took a little bit. PayPal kept its standards really high for a while, and I don't know anything much about the contemporary company, but in the era I was writing about, I would interview employees that, it's funny, I would interview employees that joined in like 2002, kind of the last year of my part of the story, and the hiring processes were like as quirky as they had been like early on, like
Yeah.
same sort of tests, same kind of round robin interviews, a little bit of the same sort of helter skelter process. And it was a place that drew a certain kind of person, which is why it attracted, today the CEO of ancestry.com, the head of airbnb.org, the senior executives at every tech company in the world, the head of Sequoia Capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a kind of talent magnet power that is possible because they didn't usually, like, there wasn't a lot of turnover. And I met so many employees, Phil, who worked there, that it was like one of these, like, every person I met, I was like blown away by how smart they were, right?
Yeah.
And that is like, it's an argument for just, there's this line in the book that Max Levchin says. He says, A's hire A's and B's hire C's. So the first B you hire takes the whole company down. And it's a little dramatic. I mean, like, a little dramatic, but it's a big article of faith, I think, for these people, is like, they only want to play with A players. And even if that means not hiring somebody, what I found in my research was that at so many different key positions, they hired like the absolute best person for that job. Not because the person had a ton of experience, but just that like the company sorted itself through a variety of ways so that they had like rock star talent in a lot of key roles.
Yes, that's good. Well, Jimmy, man, highlighting your story is awesome just because I love the tenacity to go after things that haven't been done. And, I want to thank you for just sharing your story. Are there any other pivotal moments that you want to make sure we dive into today?
Actually, let me say one thing. This is a pivotal moment. And it is a different interpretation of one of the central figures of my story than a lot of people will hear.
Yeah.
And it encompasses sort of a moment in his life, right? So I am writing about, this guy, Elon Reeve Musk, who, like, when I'm writing about him, I'm writing about him from roughly the age of, like, let's say 17, 18 to the age of like 28, 29. And I spent time talking to him about those years. And one of the things that I only realized, like, while I was finishing the book, and it's in the book now, meaning I wrote about it, but it's only something I like sort of thought about later. My 4-year period between 1998 and 2002, 2003, Elon, becomes successful. He like sells a startup, then has PayPal goes public, etc. But he also is in a pretty vicious car accident with Peter Thiel. He gets malaria and meningitis and almost dies on the hospital bed. He gets thrown out of PayPal in a coup, so his own employees sort of throw him out.
Yeah.
And he loses a child. And so in the face of all of that, like, that's like a lifetime's worth of challenges in 4 years.
Yeah.
And one of them, like losing a kid, as somebody who is a dad, it's not something I can even fathom, right? In the face of that, he picks himself up and buys the URL www.spacex.com and builds that company into sort of one of the premier kind of like space logistics, or sort of, that in that domain, there's basically nobody even close to SpaceX these days, right?
Yeah.
And it says something, because like, nobody talks about this, right? Because it's like easier to talk about whatever thing he's involved in today.
Yeah.
But I think it is really important for people to remember, like, that moment, meaning not the moment today when he's the world's wealthiest person on a given Tuesday, but the moment when, like, you have gone through basically like hell and back for 4 years. And what do you decide to do? Instead of like, and you would be forgiven. Like, if you decided to hang it up right then, you were like, I'm good. Like, I've had enough. Like, this has been enough difficulty. What does he do instead? He like continues to build this sort of thing, the things that he built and became a part of. And I think that there's some people who forget that any of that ever happened. And they forget what it must have taken to like get up in, I think it was 2003, and be like, look, I just got thrown out of this other company. Like, life has been a mess. Like, life's in chaos. Like, what? I still have this vision. I'm going to go do it. Right.
Yeah.
So, the concluding thought that for me on like rough days, I'm like, man, like, like nothing I'm doing is as hard as reusable rockets, and I have not had that kind of difficulty. So like I should be able to get up and put my pants on one leg at a time.
Yes, perspective is huge, man. I love it. Well, Jimmy, I want to say thanks so much for sharing your story and giving some insight into how you've been able to accomplish all you have. I can't wait to do this again in probably 2-3 years as you write the next book and hearing the story of how that came to be and all the amazing things you're going to do between now and then.
I love it, man. Thank you. This was great. It was super fun to chat. Like the reflections were just awesome, and I appreciate you.